Good morning. Welcome to the today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy to have you join us. This is our season number 6 of presenting this information via webinar in terms of strategic farming. Today's session is nitrogen management for January 8th, 2025. These sessions are brought to you by the University of Minnesota Extension and with generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and also from the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. My name is Dave Nicola. I'm an Extension Crops Educator located at the Farmington Regional Office. We welcome our guests today, speakers, Dr. Fabián Fernández. Fabián is Extension Specialist in Nitrogen Management with the University of Minnesota. And Fabián will be co-presenting along with Brad Carlson. Brad is a regional educator in water quality with a specialization in nitrogen management. With that, I'd like to turn it over and kick it off with Dr. Fabián Fernández. And Fabián, we talked about it a little bit earlier before we got on the air, but we certainly had a, excuse me, an interesting fall. We had farmers are able to go out into the field and get some work done. We've had a little snowfall, not a lot this year in terms of providing a lot of snow cover and moisture. But can you review some of the things in terms of your most recent research, and we can maybe delve into a little bit about split applications, but what farmers were able to do, or maybe if they didn't have an opportunity, and then talk about some of those research opportunities. And then also we're going to talk a little bit with Fabián about some upcoming really good programs that are going to take place in February that are going to be an opportunity for in-person as well as distance ed. So Fabián, I'm going to turn it over to you and give you an opportunity to provide some highlights here in terms of some of your research from the last year or so. Okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, Dave. Yes, it has definitely was an interesting growing season. They are all interesting, it seems like, but this one definitely we came out of, a few years of pretty dry conditions into spring where we thought that we would be planting really early. If you remember last winter, we hardly had any winter. And we thought that it was going to be an early season, and then we started to get rain and more rain, and so we ended up planting not early. I mean, in a lot of locations we were able to plant timely, um, but we did have a lot of rain into June and quite a bit of nitrogen loss in places. If you looked at across the landscape, it seemed like you could tell drainage issues across the fields. It was just fields with yellow and green all mixed together depending on the drainage. And so this year, some of the things that people have looked at were, split applying or rescue nitrogen applications. Some people kind of gave up and say, forget it. I'm not going to do much of a side dress application. And the yields in a lot of places were actually not too bad. I mean, in some others there were, again, all related to the drainage. But I was actually surprised with how much yield we got in some locations where the crop was just really looking bad early on, and then it recovered. And that's a testament to the amount of mineralization that we normally have in a lot of our soils. Uh, the other big challenge that we had this growing season, again talking kind of general across the state, was the fact that we went from being pretty wet to really dry later in the year, and so in some of my studies, I saw that corn cobs were not filled completely. I mean, the grain was there, but it never really bulked up. It was, there was kind of a space between the kernels telling me that the crop ran out of water, and so it didn't really fill completely. But in terms of this year, there was a lot of interest in looking at nitrogen applications in the fall. We always get questions about that, and I actually have a few slides that I would like to maybe share about some of this work. And so I'll share my screen right now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's see. All right. So do you see my screen here?
Yeah, you're in the presentation mode.
In
I
the
don't know if you want to put
presentation
it in the
mode. Yeah,
slideshow or, yeah. There you
yeah,
go.
okay. Is that good?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So this was a study that we conducted a few years back. We were looking at the fall versus spring application of urea as a nitrogen source. We had this study across 4 locations from Waseca to Crookston. We had different rotations, continuous corn and corn soybean. And the numbers there, the black numbers are for fall application, the red numbers are for the spring applications, and these are the maximum return to nitrogen values that we obtain average across all the years of the study. You can see the number of years that went into the different numbers, and then the yield at the MRTN. And then on the right, you see the difference in pounds of nitrogen needed between fall and spring, and the difference in yield production for each one of those locations. And so you can see that for all of them, regardless of where you were in the state, if you did a fall application with urea, you needed more nitrogen. There were, with the spring application, for instance, at Waseca, you needed 35 pounds less nitrogen to get to the maximum return to nitrogen, and you produce 11 bushels more yield with less nitrogen. And you can see that for all of the locations. And so it's a pretty clear message that fall applications of urea, they just don't work very well. You lose nitrogen, you're not going to get as much yield out of that crop. It will take more nitrogen to get there. And then the little table on the bottom actually shows the average across all of the sites and crop rotations. And again, you can see that there was less nitrogen needed with the spring application, and you produce more yield with less nitrogen with that spring application compared to a fall application. And then the other thing that we did in this study was to look at comparing different nitrogen sources and how often we will see a benefit. And so you have here different comparisons. These are just, for instance, the first one is anhydrous ammonia produce greater yields than urea as a broadcast and incorporated application, both fall and spring. And then the number of occurrences, and then the percentage of time where we saw a benefit. So there are a lot of numbers in here, and so I don't want to bore you with all of these numbers, but the important one is right here, the 60%. When we compare anhydrous ammonia to urea as a broadcast and incorporated application in the fall, 60% of the time we saw a benefit with that application. And in those years and sites where we had a benefit, the yield difference was 49 bushels. So a substantial difference in yield and a high percentage of probability that if you're applying nitrogen in the fall, anhydrous ammonia will be way superior than urea. And then you have other comparisons there with anhydrous ammonia versus urea as a subsurface band, ESM versus urea, ESM versus anhydrous, and any of those, I mean, the numbers don't really show much of the percentage. You have to look at what is the probability that this will work. Those numbers are all pretty low, and we could go into more detail, but that's not the point today. It's just that remember that if you're going to do fall applications, anhydrous ammonia is really the only source that we have that is more reliable. Anything else, you're going to lose nitrogen, you're going to lose yield. Now, talking about some of the conditions we saw this spring with wet conditions, we are doing quite a bit of work comparing ESN and urea for the spring, both as a pre-plant application or split application. And ESN tends to work pretty well in wet conditions because it protects nitrogen from leaching or from denitrification losses. But the interesting thing, every year is interesting, right? And this year was actually one where it was interesting to see some of those pre-plant applications with ESN, where ESN in some locations did not perform as well. And the reason for that is because we did the application pre-plant, and then we were having a lot of rain into late June. And so by that time, ESN had already released nitrogen, and so that nitrogen was subject to loss, just like urea was earlier. And so this is an important point that we could learn from this last growing season, is that these technologies, different technologies have different abilities, and they do different things. They work, but we cannot expect them to work beyond their capacity. And so, for instance, with DSN, again, if you apply a pre-plant and then you have a really wet June, chances are that you may lose some of the nitrogen. It's still, Overall, ESM performed better than urea just because, again, it protected nitrogen a little bit longer than you see with urea. And then the big question that keeps coming up is in terms of side dress application. And this year, side dress application worked well, especially in those locations where we lost quite a bit of nitrogen. Those applications later in June were better because we had less potential for nitrogen loss. But this is a study that we looked at, in theory, you look at when you have precipitation and the potential for nitrogen loss compared to when corn needs nitrogen, and you look at those curves and say, well, I should apply nitrogen as side dress time because it is after the time when we have high potential for nitrogen loss and before corn really needs nitrogen. And in theory, that looks great, but in reality, we've done a lot of studies over the years. This is just one of those studies. This was actually done across the Midwest. It was not just Minnesota, but across the Midwest, 49 site years of data. And what we did here, we had two different treatments. One in the red, where we apply either a single pre-plant application or a split application with 40 pounds actually of pre-plant and then side dressing the rest of the nitrogen around V8. And then the yellow bars is 90 pounds of nitrogen, or actually 80 pounds, 90 kilograms, 80 pounds of nitrogen at pre-plant and then side dressing the rest. And we did the comparison of, when is different. And you can see those two bars, the 80 and 84% of the sites, the split application and the single application, the majority of sites were the same. There was absolutely no difference in the yield that we obtained. And then there were a few where, side dress was better than a single pre-plant or the other way around. And those mostly had to do with very specific conditions. For instance, the split application produced better yields than the single application in like sandy soils. But by and large, we see absolutely no difference between a pre-plant and a side dress application. And the other question is people always talk about, oh, well, it's like the efficiency. You're looking, maybe you're not getting as much yield, but the efficiency may be better. Well, this shows here the total nitrogen uptake. This is all of that data for those 49 site years of data. This was a regional project again. And you see that there was absolutely no difference in terms of the utilization of that nitrogen. Both lines, the pre-plant and the side dress application are on top of each other. And then if you look at the graph on the right, is looking at the residual soil nitrogen. And you actually see that with the split application, we actually have more residual nitrogen at the end of the season compared to a pre-plant application. And it doesn't mean that that nitrogen will be around for next year. We know that we are going to not have that nitrogen for the next crop. And so keep that in mind, that side dress applications are beneficial, but they're not as much of a benefit as some people are talking about. Where I see a potential is, again, with these wet years, there is a potential for some improvement with side dress application, but again, it's not always a given. This study here is looking at a number of years where we had a pre-plant versus split applications. The pre-plant values are in red, the splits are in blue. And you see there the EONR and the yield at the EONR for soils that had adequate drainage and soils that had poor drainage. And the response that we got, it really depended on conditions. In 2016, for instance, for this data set, we had pretty favorable conditions throughout the growing season. And so you see that the split application was just as effective as a single pre-plant application in both drain and undrained soils. But then we got to 2018 where we had really wet conditions. It wasn't like this last growing season, but it was pretty wet. It was more like just huge amounts of rain coming at one time. And in those wet conditions, the drain soils were way more productive and profitable than the undrained soils. And the split applications resulted in a little bit less nitrogen needed to get to that optimum. And then overall, if you look at across all the years as an average, we find that regardless of when we apply nitrogen, the undrained soils need more nitrogen than the drained soils. And that's, again, kind of illustrates what we said this growing season, that in poor drain soils, we normally will need more nitrogen. We lose more nitrogen, so you will need more nitrogen to actually get to that economic optimum. Whether you can solve that by adding more nitrogen, it's not a given. Some years you might not actually improve yields by adding more nitrogen. And then in terms of pre-plant versus split application, well, you know, it's a toss-up, just like we saw in the previous slides. It's not a given that you have a huge benefit year in and year out with a split application compared to a pre-plant application. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we are finding. And the other thing too is in those drain versus undrained soils, um, this is looking at the total nitrogen in the system. So we looked at total nitrogen taken up by the plant, total nitrogen in the soil at the end of the season. And in the drain soil, we actually could quantify more of the total nitrogen than the undrained soil. And so we have more yield with drainage than the undrained soil. And we actually were able to quantify more of that nitrogen, which is telling us that drain soils will be more productive and better in terms of nitrogen management. We need less nitrogen, and we actually quantify or use more of that nitrogen than we do in the undrained soils, because in undrained conditions, we tend to have more potential for denitrification losses. So that's kind of what I have for in terms of updates, Dave.
Fabian, before you get to this, I had two quick questions that came in on the presentation before we talk about the workshops in February. And if you want to comment on these, one was from a listener here on how long does a polymer on ESN last? The question he has, is it 30 days or about that? But you have any opinion there about the length or how long the polymer would last on ESN?
Yeah, we have some data on that. In that study, we actually put mesh bags with the fertilizer, and we retrieve those mesh bags with the fertilizer every few weeks throughout the growing season, and we have that release curve. And so it does depend on moisture and temperature, but typically, you're looking at about 4 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks is for the total amount of that release to take place.
Okay. And the other question that came in, an individual said they split apply nitrogen partly with the at planting with the planter and part later. In that case, would you use ESN in both of those applications or just in the second application of the split? So in other words, they're putting on with the planter, some
Yep.
on later. Would you do ESN both or just at the second application?
Yeah, we are looking at that very question in the research that we are doing. And in most years, I say pre-plant application only for ESN or very, very early side dress, like, before like V2, you can probably get away with using ESN. Putting it much later than that, you risk not having enough nitrogen release in time for when the crop will need it. But interestingly, as I mentioned, this growing season, because we had such wet June, I think, if you were to apply ESN like around V4, V6, you probably would have been okay because it would have protected nitrogen through that June period where it was wet. But that's, again, kind of abnormal. I would still recommend that if you're going to use ESN, just do it pre-plant time or really, really early side dress only.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last question is, we have obviously we don't have a lot of snow on the ground right now, but if we continue with this, let's say, for example, the listener said if you have a dry spring and they're spreading, a combination of nitrogen and other and P and K, what kind of nitrogen release are you expecting from products like MAP and AMS in terms of that if they're combined into a spread this spring?
Yeah, so in the spring it should be fine. I mean, we map DAP, any of those, the nitrogen and as well as the phosphorus, it's released pretty quickly. Those, are soluble fertilizers, and so they will release nutrients in no problem. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to talk about the slide that we have up here? A couple of conferences coming up in the month of February here. These are things that we've done for a number of years, and maybe talk about the dates here and the highlight. And I guess we have the URL for registration, but you want to comment on each of those?
Yeah, for sure. So the nitrogen conference is coming up now on February 4th. This will be in Mankato. And as in previous years, we will have different topics covered during the conference. We will talk about kind of weather and how it impacted this year or last year's growing season. So we'll have Kenny Bloomfield talking about kind of the weather and predictions for this coming growing season. We will have a panel discussion with farmers talking a little bit about their experiences and what they saw this last growing season. And then we'll start going into managing nitrogen. What can we do with nitrogen in our farms? Can we do our own research to find answers to questions that we may have? Brad Carlson will be talking about that, and then we'll get into more of a kind of nitrogen management from the research standpoint. What we are seeing, both in terms of production and environmental concerns around nitrogen management, and we'll talk a little bit at the end. There will be a few talks about cover crops and cropping system management and how that impacts nitrogen. Then the other conference, Nutrient Management Conference, that will be on February 18th. This will be in St. Cloud. And this one, we normally cover, broader topics, not just nitrogen, like in the nitrogen conference. We tend to cover the spectrum of topics related to nutrients. This year, though, the conference will be solely focused on phosphorus. There is a lot of research going on with phosphorus, and so we decided to put a program together just focused on phosphorus. So it will be a really good conference as well. We will have people from different states, from surrounding states, talking about what they are doing with phosphorus, with the phosphorus recommendations that many of the states are revising their recommendations. They are looking at how to manage phosphorus more effectively. And at the end of the conference, we will have our own Minnesota experts talking about phosphorus. So we'll have Melissa Wilson talking about from the manure side of things. Lindsay Pease from the Northwest, from Crookston, will be talking about some of the research that she is doing, both in terms of agronomic and environmental aspects of phosphorus. And Dan Kaiser will talk about the research that he's doing statewide with phosphorus. So two great conferences, a lot of content. It will be, as we've done in the past, both the option of in-person or online participation.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll appreciate that. We'll talk more about that later and get those dates back up there. But I want to switch over to our other speaker today. Brad Carlson is with us. He is our educator based at the Mankato Regional Office. But Brad, there's a lot of talk right now about economics going forward here with all the different inputs and so forth that farmers have to consider. You have some comments about input economics, particularly with nitrogen. Maybe review a little bit about when we talk about MRTN, what exactly is that and how farmers can take advantage of some of those information, whether it's on the web with a calculator or whatever else. And then you can also talk about some of the workshops that you're going to be involved with. So I'm going to give you the floor. Okay.
Yeah, so one of the things, a data set that I've worked with a lot over the last few years, people that see me present, hear me talk about this occasionally, is related to the adult farm management program in Minnesota, which I think most producers, at least in Minnesota, are familiar with. Some are participants, of course, that helps farmers with doing their financial records as far as cash flows and helps out with your taxes or when you need to go to the bank or you're analyzing your enterprises to see profitability and so forth. The data from that, and that's a joint program between the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities and the University of Minnesota, kind of coordinated at the highest level by the U of M Center for Farm Financial Management. And that the records that are generated every year are dumped into a database, and it is available for free for anyone on the internet. It's called FinBin. It's a U of M website. And you can do various searches in FinBin looking at different regionality in the state or different crops or different production practices and so forth. And if you went back to the earliest parts of my career, back when I first started and I was a county agent, of course, I was getting invited to the local tech college annual banquet that they had where they were going through their annual summaries. And so one of the instructors there, Doug Wordish, used to always do a sort looking at the most profitable farmers and the least profitable farmers. And he would go through the numbers and everything from what kind of a crop price the most profitable people got and what kind of yields they got to what the least profitable were. For the sake of the individuals who had their own numbers in front of them, they could kind of see where they shook out and what they got compared to what the people who were making the most money got. And so a number of years ago, I kind of was reflecting on that and decided to take a look at fertilizer costs for those groups. And so I just pulled the record across the most corn producing parts of the state, southeast, south central, and southwest, and west central Minnesota. And I looked at corn production and I threw out manure users because the economics of manure are there's some discrepancies between how different farms report that. And so we just kind of took that out. And what I discovered was that the most profitable farms, the 20% most profitable farms, spent 25% less on fertilizer than the least profitable farms. In essence, the least profitable farms were greatly overspending on fertilizer. And I looked at other crop inputs such as seed cost and discovered that that was not necessarily a trend on other inputs. It was particular to fertilizer was being overspent on a lot. And I continued to pull those records every year, and they varied anywhere. I think the low year was 15%, but all the way up to 30%. And finally, this last year, when I pulled these, now mind you, these records, of course, are backwards looking, and so they're you guys haven't done your taxes yet. That's coming up, but the dump of those records into the database and then the ability to go search those typically doesn't happen until March. And so it's usually not till towards the end of the March we can get the previous year's growing season. And so these are the 2023 numbers. The 2024 numbers probably won't be available until the end of March in 2025. But the average amount of money spent on the 20% most profitable farms in Minnesota on fertilizer in 2023 was $217 an acre. The average amount spent by the 20% least profitable farms was $289 an acre. It was huge. It was 33%. They're spending 1/3 more on fertilizer than the people making the most money. Now, because these records are anonymous, we're not able to go back and find out who these people are and find out what they did, So in essence, it's us kind of using our experience and judgment and talking to a lot of folks and what we've experienced. And I came up with a list of the things that were typically, I'm quite certain, contributing to the over expense on fertilizer. And I put this out as a blog post, but of course, it came out right at the beginning of the growing season last year because the numbers weren't available until then, and all the fertilizer decisions were pretty much made last year, other than what happened with some of the extreme weather conditions. And so the primary reasons why someone is overspending on fertilizer, in my experience, number one is applying too high of a rate. I mean, quite frankly, if you're applying fertilizer the crop doesn't need, you're not getting a return on your investment. And so if you are overspending on too much fertilizer, it's just basically wasted money. And so that's probably the number one to be examined by producers. And particularly, I always go back to I realize that U of M recommendations are not the be all end all for all situations. However, they are produced by hundreds of research trials. And so it definitely is a benchmark to compare where you're at. And if you're greatly over U of M recommendations, the question needs to be to yourself is why. There are reasons why. There are valid reasons why, but you should have a reason, not just simply like, oh, well, I don't think those guys are right. Well, there's a lot of research that went into that. Number two is a combination of bad practices. Fabian just went through a lot of data looking at the problems with fall urea. And so what we discover frequently is when we see too high of a rate, oftentimes that higher rate is being used to compensate for something else you did that wasn't right, like putting on fall urea, which we really haven't recommended uh, for a long time. And so the so if you're for instance applying fertilizer when it's too warm in the fall, if you're applying fertilizer and not using a nitrification inhibitor, which is something we recommend, that would be with anhydrous ammonia. If you're fall applying urea, frequently violating one of the 4Rs then violates another one of the 4Rs, which is needing to apply too high of a rate to compensate for that. And so that's another one. Moving over to the P and K side, applying crop removal rates when you've already got a high soil test. There's been a pretty in-depth study where we show that crop removal rates, in most cases, when you're already at the high soil test level, it actually increases soil test over time. It doesn't make intuitive sense. We think about what we're hauling to the elevator in the semi and what's in there for P and K, and just simply want to put that back in the field. But the research shows pretty clearly if you apply that crop removal rate, we're building soil test levels. And so that's really not to your economic advantage to do that. So really settling in on a rate of fertilizer, a P and K application that maintains your soil test levels at an optimum or high rate versus something that's continually building, again, prevents overspending on fertilizer. Fabian also just went through the data on split applications. We recommend split application in irrigated situations and sandy soils. In essence, any place that's likely to lose nitrogen because of some condition will benefit from a split application. In general, though, all things being equal, split application doesn't usually pay for itself. The whole concept of spoon feeding nitrogen isn't really a concept. It's not like you personally sitting down at the table and wondering if your food was just freshly cooked or brought out of the refrigerator. The plant really doesn't care when the nitrogen got to the soil. It's either there or it's not there. And so if you apply it all at one time and you didn't lose it, it's still there. And so split applying it can just simply double your application cost. And so that's all part of this. Using premium fertilizers. I'm not really necessarily talking about, Fabian just talked a lot about ESN. That's a well-researched product that we've seen benefits for. But I think most guys are familiar with other stuff that's on the market. You go to the farm shows and you see these tables of stuff, and we all know that it's higher priced than the stuff you can buy at the co-op or the dealer, where you just buy regular MAP and DAP and urea from. And if you talk to these people, they'll say, well, but our product is better because, well, in a lot of cases, there's no research behind that to indicate it actually is better. For instance, there's no reason to say you need to apply food grade phosphorus with your planter as just opposed to just standard starter fertilizer. But those products can be very expensive. And so be careful with falling for that kind of a sales line. So then the last one is relative to some of the technology that's out there right now. And it's a bit of a difficult situation, but conceptually, what we've discovered through a lot of the work that we've done with variable rate nitrogen application and using technology for advising fertilizer recommendations is we've discovered that in most cases, in most fields, we actually are applying the correct rate of fertilizer. Guys kind of knew that, or potentially even more than you need. So the idea here is if you are not finding places where you are applying too little, there really is no chance for a yield improvement. Obviously, if it says to apply less, you literally will not get a higher yield on less fertilizer. Now, the idea is if the advice from the technology is accurate, you're getting the same yield and you're reducing your input cost, but you're not going to get an increased yield from applying less fertilizer. And so there's a lot of guys who are investing in some of these technologies, whether it's drones or whatever else it might be. Then they're getting back these maps saying you're applying adequate or you need to apply less. And in a lot of cases, like, oh, well, there's no management to be done here. Well, you've paid for some technology there that ended up not actually producing any profit for you. And so those are kind of the main features that I highlighted in that blog post back last summer. And so you can debate on about all that stuff, but that's kind of my 2 cents on that topic. Yeah, so
yeah.
go ahead, David.
I was going to say, can we get a couple of questions and I want to come back to you and talk about upcoming workshops. But before we do, we got some questions that came in.
Yep.
And then Fabian, so both Brad and Fabian, if you can hang on, can tag team on these answers and so forth. But one of the first questions was, do you believe that there's any benefit to variable rate applying pre-plant and in-season nitrogen across different soil types or management zones? So I don't know who wants to tackle that one.
Well, like I just got done saying, in a lot of cases, if you apply a flat rate, it's probably adequate amount of fertilizer in most situations. And so your advantage is the potential to be able to reduce the fertilizer rate and still get the same yield. Yeah, environmentally, that's an advantage because if you're applying fertilizer the crop doesn't need, it's subject to be lost. Economically, it's an advantage because you're not paying for fertilizer that you didn't need. However, the dollar value of unpurchased fertilizer is relatively small compared to the value of a large yield increase. But if the large yield increase isn't out there to be had, then that's where your advantage is some small profit from applying less fertilizer. And so that's been a lot of my experience with variable rate nitrogen.
Yeah,
Fabian, any comments? Yep.
yeah, so going back to what Brad said earlier about the 4 R's, we normally tend to focus on rate when we variable rate. Well, what about variable source or variable timing? Those I think are sometimes the things that we need to be looking at. When we just focus only on rate, we may be missing the fact that you may apply more nitrogen in one location just to compensate for loss. And so you could be smart by applying maybe a more expensive source of nitrogen that protects nitrogen to a greater extent in areas of, let's say, a field where you know that it's poor drainage. The nitrogen is more likely to be lost there than in other parts of the field. Well, maybe there is where you could do a variable application with using technology that is a little bit more expensive, whether it's like ESN or protecting nitrogen with a nitrification inhibitor, those kinds of things, and not just only focusing on the rate. That's what I see the biggest advantage.
Another question came in, and I don't know, this kind of relates back to the Finbin data, Brad, and you can comment too, Fabian. One of the questions is, most strip till operations use less fertilizer than conventional till operations. Did you exclude the strip till operations, or is this a possibility where the difference in fertilizer cost is skewing the numbers?
I did not exclude that. And I guess from my experience with all the strip tillers I work with, while a lot of them are philosophically using less fertilizer, there is nothing specific to strip till that should require less fertilizer. So if they are using less fertilizer and they are not hurting their yield, that certainly is an impact that needs to go into this analysis, and I would not exclude that.
And just a little bit of from my experience when I was doing P&K work in Illinois, I did quite a bit of work in looking at those questions with the strip till, and we found that a pound of phosphorus is a pound of phosphorus, and if you need it, you'll benefit from it. If you don't need it, you're not going to see a difference. And so I did get a lot of those questions back when I was in Illinois, and I suspect Dan and others that are working on P&K mostly get those questions still. And the data just doesn't support it. If you need phosphorus or potassium or any nutrient, you'll get the benefit, but the strip till itself, it doesn't require less nutrient than conventional or anything else.
Switching gears now, we don't have Melissa Wilson, our manure specialist, online here, but I think you guys can take a stab at this. One of the listeners said, I'm concerned that a lot of manure was fall applied this year when the soil temperatures were warm. Is this a valid concern? First question. The second part is dairy or hog manure more likely to be lost if fall applied? So it's a two-part question.
Yes, it's a valid concern. It's been a valid concern for a long time. The data does kind of indicate that we're better off applying manure following the same application recommendations we have for commercial fertilizer. We realize the logistics of livestock operations and manure handling do not always allow that to be delayed until the soil temperature is below 50 degrees. However, I will also say that if the application's made a lot earlier than that, there should be steps taken to try and mitigate that loss, particularly looking at planting cover crops. Bad year for that. It was really dry this fall. I don't know how much cover crop actually got germinated. I'm not seeing a lot out in the country. And from that standpoint, yes, there's also a difference in those manure types because of the high level of inorganic nutrient in swine manure versus dairy manure. The dairy manures got a lot more complex molecules in there that first need to be broken down just simply into the ionic forms before conversion. They would convert to nitrate and potentially be lost, versus a lot of the swine manure starts out as ammonium right from the get-go, and so it doesn't take as nearly as long to convert that. And yeah, it's definitely a concern, and it's something I guess we really would like producers to keep an eye on, management wise, both from your pocketbook and profitability perspective. But I think as an industry, we also really need to be keeping an eye on some of these water quality issues, and do what we can, because this could end up coming back and biting us.
I don't know if you want to comment on dairy versus hog manure, or we can get this to Melissa in terms of potential for loss, one versus the other, or not.
So, well, yeah, I mean, you are like Brad said, with dairy manure, you have less chance of losing nitrogen just because it takes longer for those compounds to break down into inorganic forms. And whereas hog manure, you have quite a bit of that nitrogen is already in the ammonium form, so it can be nitrify, and once it's nitrate, then we can lose it. But the thing that I think we need to also be looking at is, again, with these practices, what is the probability? And I think if I look at, the last 11 years I've been in Minnesota, I would say that the falls are getting longer. It tends to stay warmer, or we have long spells of warm temperatures longer and longer into the fall. And this is where practice and what should be done gets complicated, because yes, you have to empty the pits, you have to apply that manure, but at the same time we are seeing that we are getting warmer in the fall, and so the warmer it is, the more chance of that process, those biological process, to take place and to make nitrogen into inorganic forms and then nitrify, which starts the potential for nitrogen loss.
We have a rather detailed next question here on ESN, and the listener wants to know, they would be interested to know if there is a difference between spring applied ESN versus anhydrous ammonia, and in quotes, when the anhydrous ammonia is either fall or spring, with an inhibitor, okay, from an availability perspective, and then what is the economics of when ESN is more cost effective or vice versa. So it's a couple of things in there, but basically the first part of the question is spring applied ESN versus anhydrous ammonia, particularly when there's an inhibitor involved in here. What about the availability, and then what's the implication on economics? So I don't know, Fabian, you've done some work on that. You want to take a stab at that first?
Yeah, so I it kind of depends on the year. That's perfect extension answer, right? It depends.
Yep.
But it depends because if you have low potential for nitrogen loss between the fall and the spring, most of the time with anhydrous ammonia, we are not concerned about nitrogen fall and nitrogen loss in the fall. Is more what happens in the spring, right? If it's wet, by that time the inhibitor starts to break down and you can start losing some of that nitrogen. You have a longer window of time between the application and the time of the crop uptake. And so in most situations, and this is based on the research that we've done, is anhydrous ammonia in the fall versus anything in the spring tends to be a little bit less efficient. Okay, in general, there are years where that's not the case. It's about the same, but in general, you tend to lose a little bit more of that nitrogen or the yield compared to a spring application of anything, whether it's anhydrous or urea or ESN or anything. And so from that standpoint, I would say yes, fall does have a little bit more of a risk, even with anhydrous ammonia and the inhibitor, than a spring application. In terms of the actual cost, I am not 100% sure. I mean, we do have some of that data. We haven't penciled it out to look at the cost benefit for, a fall anhydrous with inhibitor versus spring ESN application, for instance. But I suspect that they are not that different.
Okay. I guess for both, and then look, Brad, you've looked at some of the data from other people, but also Fabian here. A question came in your studies. We talk about that there isn't necessarily a large economic benefit of split end applications. But the question is, what about the method of the second application? Is there any data or opinion on wide drop compared to a coulter or a dry spread in terms of making that second application, in terms of how that may play into economics? Any comment about the application method in making a difference here in terms of a split?
Yeah, so Jeff Vetch actually did a research project on this at Wasika a few years ago, where they were looking at Y drops, and kind of what we all said with Y drops when they came on the market is it's a fine application method. We just don't see a reason why it would be any better than anything else. And they actually found a trend towards higher yields with a single dribble band versus the double with the Y drops. Now, there's some reasons for that. Potentially, you're just splitting up the area you could lose from, and plus there was some issues with their nozzles wandering around and some other stuff like that. I think the point being they didn't see a yield advantage to using a Y drop versus just a single dribble band. And I know a lot of producers that I know that are or were using Y drops went to taking off every other unit and just putting on, one for each row of corn, skipping, and then putting on again, and then putting the full rate on with each dribble. That's a fine application method. It really gets down to, are you able to do that, and what's the economics of that? There's really nothing wrong with top dress either. Of course, the thing you have to realize with top dress with urea is it is subject to be lost. And so if you don't get rainfall a quarter of an inch to put that in, if it's excessively hot and windy, even if you use a urease inhibitor, the Agritane or similar products, and it's like 95 degrees, you can walk out on those fields and you can smell ammonia. So there's that risk too. But all things being equal, if it's cool and moist and you get a rainfall, there's not much difference between them. We know that from an industry perspective, we can cover massive numbers of acres top dressing with the current application equipment that's out there. It can get on in a real hurry, and so from that standpoint, we're doing pretty good as far as the ability to do that application. I guess it really just comes down to what works for people and what your personal economics are. The only other thing I will say, though, about the split application is very particularly if you are going to do variable rate nitrogen, it does allow you to better adjust those variable rates. And so you put on a flat rate at pre-plant and the variable rate at side dress, much more of the growing season has passed to be able to base your decision on. And so, from that standpoint, making that decision at V4, that second week of June, is a lot better than making that decision in the middle of April. And so, there is that ability.
We do a number of workshops on soil health and on soils and so forth. Some coming up here in February. This question has kind of a relationship to that, and it gets back to Soils 101. But the question is, what concern should we have for salt levels of fertilizer in regards to soil health? So, I mean, we don't want to take up a lot of time with this answer, but any comments that you might want to have on that, just in general?
Yeah, I mean, the amount of salt that we add with the fertilizers is not so high. And then the other part is that we do have water. If we are looking, Western US where you have limitations, then it could be a problem. But in here, any excess salt will get washed out, and so if there is a potential for a detriment to soil health, it will be very, very temporary because that salt will be out of the system before very long.
I'm going to skip ahead here to a question I think involving inhibitors. And this is in general, this has come up before. Does mixing ammonium thio with liquid N, does the ATS in that case act as a nitrogen inhibitor?
Yeah, that has been a question that has been asked many times, and Jay Goose at North Dakota State actually looked at that very closely, and it does have some inhibition-like properties, but it's not so strong that you would recommend or think of that as an inhibitor.
The thing you always have to remember about inhibitors is not really whether they work or not, because in general, there's products out there that definitely work. Is do they work long enough to make a difference? And so that's really the question when you're doing the application and using those products is not did they slow down the conversion to nitrate? Did they do it at a time and for long enough that it made any difference? And that's really what you got to ask yourself.
Question came in from a good friend of mine, a former coworker, Will Anthony. He was at the Waseca Research and Updates yesterday, and I will put a plug in for this research and updates at Orinoco on Thursday, and then next week on Tuesday at Wilmer, and then followed Lamberton and Crookston. But anyhow, Will asked about, do you recommend nitrogen inhibitors with manure?
Well,
Yeah.
there's been some research that's been really quite variable. The research at Waseca did show kind of a trend to there being a benefit for that. However, some of the research done at Waseca and done in Wisconsin and done in Iowa didn't show a whole lot. Personally, I do like the use of the Instinct products when we're doing an application that's prior to the soil temperature being below 50. I think every little bit is going to help there, and that's kind of my experience. And they did see some benefit at Waseca. Again, it really just depended on what the conditions were like. Did that last long enough to make a difference?
Yeah, the big question there with inhibitors is I think folks sometimes get this false impression that using the inhibitor allows them to go earlier in the fall to do the application, and the reality is that the inhibitor will break down faster the warmer the temperature, and so I would definitely recommend an inhibitor. But I would not use that as a crutch to say, well, let's apply earlier than we would normally do.
The data at Waseca showed that while an October application found a distinct advantage for using the inhibitor, a November application without the inhibitor still was better than the October application with the inhibitor.
Yeah.
Okay, we probably won't get to all of these questions, but Diane or Phyllis, we could capture some of these so these guys can respond offline in terms of emailing back. But I'm going to go to one of them before we get to Brad here to close things out. And this is on N rates and management. Do they need to be changed if you're going to go into a minimum till situation where you have a lot of surface residue versus where you have conventional tillage? Do you need to apply some additional pounds of N to compensate for less mineralization early in the season? So this is kind of a convoluted way around there, but we'll do that last, then we'll get to you, Brad, about workshops. So
I'm going to let Fabian take that one, but I will point out that North Dakota's nitrogen recommendations are to apply less if you're doing no-till.
Yeah, I was gonna say the research that we've done in South Central Minnesota, looking at different tillage systems, it shows that there is no difference in the amount of nitrogen needed, and you do get less mineralization typically early on with no till just because it's cooler. But that goes kind of back to some of those questions about starter fertilizer. Typically, you get physical advantage in looking the crop looking a little bit better early in the season, but it doesn't hardly ever translate into better yield later in the season because mineralization will take over eventually.
okay, Brad, you've got kind of the last word in here before we close things out. Do you want to talk about some of the things that you're involved with for opportunities to take a deeper dive into the economics and some workshops?
Well, so we've been offering our advanced nitrogen smart classes the last couple of years packaged together in what we call Nitrogen College, which is 2 days, and we've got actually 5 of our curriculums that we offer over 2 days, no cost, thanks to support from Minnesota corn growers. And those events this year, I just confirmed them yesterday, so they're not out there anywhere. We are going to be in Marshall on the 5th and 6th of March in the Red Baron Ice Arena. There's a nice meeting room on the upstairs level there. And then we are going to be in Crookston at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center Auditorium on the 19th and 20th of March. And no pre-registration is required for those. You can take in any or all of the sessions. The first day we'll have our deep dive into the 4 R's. In the morning, we will have our adapting nitrogen management to climate in the afternoon. And then on the second day in the morning, we have our curriculum on reducing nitrate loss to water. And then in the afternoon, Dan's presentation on using biologicals in nitrogen management and my presentation on variable rate nitrogen in the afternoon. And so you can come and go to any of those sessions. We don't offer lunch. I'm sorry about that, but with people coming and going, we have no good way of knowing how many people will be there. So kind of be prepared to run out and get some lunch at noon or bring your own or something like that. So we have those going on. And then the last event is we are going to have a nitrogen smart focused, but regionally focused with other information also geared towards the issues going on in southeast Minnesota. I think a lot of people are aware of what's been happening there with some of the high nitrate levels in private wells and the US EPA petition and some of that stuff. That is going to be on March 13th. It is going to be on the Olmsted County Fairgrounds. I believe it's Ann Hall is the location, but we'll be getting that out there. And so that will be kind of a combination of some of our nitrogen smart materials, but also a lot of southeast focused stuff relative to the issues that are going on there right now. So look forward to those events. And again, there's no cost to attend any of those. Look at our webpage, z.umn.edu/nitrogen smart, and we will get that stuff posted very soon. Like I said, just confirmed it yesterday, so it's not up there yet.
At the risk of giving both of you more work and maybe Dan Kaiser, I'm going to make a recommendation. We have a whole host of page of questions that came in for registrations that we didn't have time to get to. So there might be an opportunity, what I would recommend if a future crop news article that we do on a regular basis in crop news to look at a lot of these questions and just produce one on from a Q&A and get at some of these answers from a nutrient management standpoint, Fabian and Brad, I think would be very good, because there's a lot of things we just plain didn't have an opportunity to, and I think these are common questions that a lot of producers and ag professionals have in Minnesota. So never fear, we're going to try to get to those. There's some of those questions that came through on today's seminar. We're going to go back and try to answer those on an email situation but anyhow, there is we could go on for 3 hours here longer. There's no doubt about that. But certainly we will try to get with those. So, but thank you again for everybody that is listening today and attending Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops programs. This is being recorded. We will have an opportunity for placing this up probably by next week in terms of more information where you can go back and listen to it again. Thanks to Fabian and Brad for coming on and being part of this program today. And finally, we want to thank our sponsors, Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, along with the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council.